Hi everyone, this is Social Change, lecture number 3, Harper and Lee, chapter 4, American Social Trends, pages 66 to 82, and this is part 2. Okay, let's start. So we discussed structural trends, and now we'll move on to changing cultural themes. So cultural themes, these patterns of social attitudes, beliefs, and values, are very subjective, variable, and not everyone in society shares them. However, here are some of them. One is the growing complexity and diversity itself. And this is related to the growth of structural complexity that we talked about in media and sources occupations. Think about proliferation of many subcultures based on occupation, gender, ethnicity, age, religion, and recreational pursuits, such as music, for example. Think about why do we need subcultures and what do they offer? There are distinctive cultural styles or lifestyles among bikers, metalheads, skinheads, hipsters, gays, and senior citizens, among many, many others, of course. Cultural complexity is also increased by the influx of new immigrants from Asia, Latin America, and Middle East. And classic example of this rising complexity and diversity is the rise of the acceptance of multiracial identity, because many of us now identify ourselves by several ethnicities, not just one. But of course, this topic is quite controversial. It's important to mention that the US has always been diverse in terms of race and ethnicity and cultural characteristics. However, this cultural pluralism or multiculturalism has been opposed by powerful social and political pressures to incorporate or assimilate diverse cultures into a common American culture. This is an argument that you might have heard about, the melting pot versus the salad bowl, right? Where America was thought of as being a melting pot where people from many different cultures came in and melted into a single American culture. Others argue that we live in America that is more of a salad bowl where people do come from many different cultures, but they don't melt into one single American culture. Rather, they retain the taste and the values of their previous culture while incorporating into American society at the same time. All right. Another changing cultural theme is the increasing toleration of cultural diversity, including multiculturalism. So, after World War II, and especially after the 60s, Americans were increasingly willing to accept and tolerate diversity. And new immigrants created these ethnic conclave communities. For example, Greenpoint in Brooklyn was very Polish, since I'm Polish, I'll mention it. And even churches in these communities asserted their distinctiveness. There's also growth in acceptance and legitimacy of behavioral and moral diversity. Things like premarital sex, abortion, women in the labor force, cohabitation, living single or being married with no kids, and even gay marriage are more and more acceptable. However, this does not mean that forms of discrimination disappeared, because there are always what Harper and Lee call dual realities. So, although the pressure to conform is quite strong, toleration has been less effective with racial, cultural, ethnic groups. Another changing cultural theme is this increasing concern with individual self gratification. In other words, growing need for individuality and preoccupation with self. So, what they mean is that we are more and more concerned with our self fulfillment. And although that in itself is not new, the extent of which it goes to, it is. It's amplified with the spread of humanistic psychology and the human potential movement of the 1960s, such as the women's movement and the civil rights movement. Some argue that we even moved towards the culture of narcissism, and 1970s even got the name of the Me Decade. We're also more aware now of how others live, and because this happens, of course, because we're more connected to them, more connected than we have ever been before. And this, of course, leads to self-reflection and to more choice. However, it's important to note that there's also a dark side to all this preoccupation with individualism and self-absorption. We are cutting people off from social support, leaving them on their own, confused and lonely. We have this policy of ending welfare. And we sometimes even are sanctioning the most outrageous forms of political greed, personal greed. There's this 1% versus the rest of us. And I sent you guys the link to the income inequality video. And I'm not sure if you guys recently saw, but there's this movie, The Wolf of Wall Street, right, which talks about this kind of issue. Another changing cultural theme is the belief in the effectiveness in scientific and empirical knowledge. This empirical rationality, meaning that we're moving away from traditional way of doing things towards more empirical, rational, and technological way of thinking and doing. And we're more likely to turn towards doctors and family therapists for advice with childbearing and family problems. This persistence of empirical rationality is, of course, related to secularization, the separation, from religious or spiritual influences. However, religion, of course, has not withered away in America. It's still very important, but it became more of a, a personal or private sphere issue rather than a public sphere issue. Okay, so another cultural theme is the decreasing trust in national leaders and social institutions. Again, this in itself is not new. Think back to the 1970s and the anti-war movement, when Americans became increasingly cynical about credibility, competence, and honesty of their leaders. And we're talking about leaders in government, business, banks, religion, public schools, media, and even other institutions. It might be due to critical media reporting of specific events, such as political, corporate, or military scandals. But Harper also argues that this might reflect a widespread belief that the interests of people are not being honestly and competently served by the leaders and social institutions. And why that might be so? Because many of us might believe that these leaders are not serving us as the ordinary people, but rather they're serving the elites. This might signify a larger legitimacy crisis, a complete loss of faith and credibility of the American system, which might have quite dire consequences. However, others argue that cynicism itself is a social disease that promotes disagreements and silences dialogue. What do you guys think? Do you trust your leaders? Do you believe the fact that people in power do the best, or the best for whom? And then there are some counter trends and reactions to modernity, anti-modernism, and postmodernism. So for every trend and theme that we have mentioned, we can pinpoint opposition to it. For example, with growing tolerance, one might point out to the resurgence of racism and ethnic discrimination in the US. Some might argue that we have moved away from overt and blatant racism or sexism because these are now illegal. But now we have to deal with covert or hidden discrimination. So basically, racism continues, but in new and subtle forms. We have things like racial profiling, or I'm sure many of you remember the Sean Bell's case. Symbolic racism may play an increasing role. We have all these controversies about underclass, crime, drugs, and public welfare, and in part, only in part, of course, these discussions can represent codes for racist attitudes and fears that cannot be openly stated. And since 1990s, media also publicized the existence of small but radical racist and anti-Semitic hate groups, from neo-Nazis, skinheads, KKK, to even Aryan Nation. And those are reactions to pervasive structural trends and cultural themes of modernity. Those are most intensely found among those who experience recent change in negative ways, and this activity might have been increased by the economic crisis that hit us. People often say that these immigrants, right, it's their fault, they're taking our jobs and so on. This is just an example of this. Think about the diffusion of multiculturalism in education. Some people have attacked, using the code of political correctness, those who try to transform the traditional curriculum to include the needs of perspectives of women, minorities, and non-Europeans, whose numbers might have increased in American higher education. There are also reactions against this extreme individualism about which we talked about. Research suggests that growing numbers of Americans regularly participate in some form of small group activities, from Bible study groups to 12-step programs to book clubs, sports or hobby, or even political or civic groups. And in such settings, people find friends, got emotional support, overcame addictions, or grown spiritually. Or in other words, people have found community. Other reactions seek not to restore traditions, but rather to promote new stages of cultural and social development that are beyond modernity. For example, this New Age movement emphasizing wholeness and integrated lifestyle, with emphasis of mysticism, astrology. Think even about the widespreadness of yoga, right? And how this mindfulness is now very important. Another movement is postmodernism, and this is an intellectual movement that more directly attacks modern society and culture. It shares some similarities with New Age spirituality, but it is more intellectual and political in nature. POMO, as we sociologists call postmodernist, POMO argues that modern technological society devitalizes life and robs humans of subjective dimensions of experience that are found in myth, art, emotion, and community, and it argues that modern society is too managed by objectivity of bureaucracy and media, process that in actuality represses and deforms freedom, consciousness, and subjective life of a person. With postmodernists, for example, one issue is that history is history is problematic because history is always written by the winners, and therefore it doesn't reflect the fullness of experience. In postmodernism, people have to reclaim their subjective lives, empower themselves to live freely, naturally, and artfully. However, others argue that postmodernism is a road to political ineffectiveness that masks horrible repression as people spend more time finding themselves and contesting meanings, leaving the world of politics and economics to wealthy and powerful elites. This is where I'm going to leave you guys, and I'm going to ask, what do you think about all this? What do you think about these trends and the counter trends to them? And I will talk to you guys very soon.